And we need to demand justice. If we don't see to it that the guilty parties are punished, we're inviting them to kill us next time. So we have to demand justice. But we have to be careful. You can't just believe everything you hear. In fact, President Bush himself has very rightly warned us.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
But to millions of proud Americans, it was the president's conspiracy theory about 19 amateur hijackers with box cutters, supposedly directed by some nut in a cave, somehow overcoming the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world, that seemed like an outrageous conspiracy theory to us. As early as the next day, September 12th, millions, literally millions of Americans thought that the idea that the Pentagon had been hit showed that this was an inside job. We were supposed to believe that a hijacked, slow-moving 757 could penetrate Pentagon airspace, could penetrate missile defenses, could penetrate defenses designed to stop supersonic jet fighters and bombers, and could do it 50 minutes after everyone in the country knew we were under attack. Pretty outrageous. The following day, September 12th, we were asked to believe a more detailed and more ridiculous story, that the plane that flew into Pentagon airspace then made a 240-degree turn around the building, exposing the plane's long and broad side to attack from ground defenses, all without a shot being fired? On September 12th, we were told that if the plane had not made this incredible turn, if it had just headed straight into the Pentagon, it would have crashed into the most high-level, top-secret area of the Pentagon. It would have crashed into the offices of Donald Rumsfeld and all the top brass. But instead of flying straight ahead, it made this ridiculous turn so that it crashed into an area that had been under construction for weeks before, into an area that had been specially reinforced during those weeks to make it more able to withstand just such an attack. And it crashed into an area that, because of the construction, was mostly empty and only contained people who had been judged by the killers as deserving death. Let's say that again. If 9/11 was an inside job, the people who were present at the Pentagon and who had been assigned to work in this very special area had been very specifically selected for death. And then we had to sit and watch as in the next week, Richard Myers, the man in charge of North American air defenses that day, the single individual most responsible for the disaster, instead of being court-martialed and shot, was instead promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Outrageous. Simply outrageous. On the morning of September 11th, many building engineers and demolition experts were disturbed as they watched the collapse of the Twin Towers. No steel frame building in the history of the world had ever collapsed in this manner. A few had been knocked down by earthquakes, but never by fire, or even by planes. In 1945, the Empire State Building was hit by a U.S. Air Force B-25 bomber, killing 14 people, but causing no significant damage to the building's steel frame. The designers of the World Trade Center anticipated such hazards.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
A 707, by the way, is heavier than the planes that hit the World Trade Center. And 20 minutes after the second plane crash, when nearly all the jet fuel had been burned up, the buildings just seemed to explode, throwing steel girders weighing hundreds of tons for hundreds of feet, burying them into buildings on the other side of the street. Virtually all of the fuel from the planes had been consumed in the first 20 minutes. Where did all this explosive force come from? But most of all, the engineers were disturbed by the apparent collapse of the enormously strong central core of the towers. An indestructible rectangle of 47 box beam columns made with 4-inch thick steel at the base, tied together with a tight net of more steel girders and trusses, making up the backbone of the World Trade Center. Even if the floors had pancaked around it, after the floors collapsed, we should have seen the central core standing tall, rising out of the smoke. And we do see parts of the core, for a moment, standing in the smoke, before they simply evaporate, inexplicably. Buildings have pancaked in the past, but they looked like this, not like this. Why do we see no floors pancaked on top of each other? And so people began to look more closely at the video of the collapse, and they began to see more evidence that something else was going on. That the buildings had been taken down not by exploding planes, but by explosive charges planted in the building. In a professional demolition, you see what are called squibs, where the explosives occasionally vent their explosive force out the side of the building. And sure enough, when you look, you can see squibs going off all over. The specialized explosive used by professionals to demolish a steel frame is called thermite. It is placed in key locations and melts large steel joints in an instant, which is precisely what we see here. Look closely at this photograph. This is one of the box girders of the central core. Look at it. It's been clearly melted. Although jet fuel does not create anything near the heat necessary to melt steel, the physicists and engineers began to find evidence of large amounts of molten steel pouring out of the side of the building, pouring down into the basement, creating incredible temperatures, 1100 degrees at the top of the rubble pile 6 weeks later.
Still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
And turning up months later as huge chunks of iron and concrete slag. And slowly, other information began to come out. Information that proved dramatically and indisputably the true nature of the conspiracy behind this horrible crime. We learned that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Building 7, a 42-story glass and steel structure located across the street from the World Trade Center, collapsed. It was not hit by any planes at all. It appeared to have suffered only minor damage, but nevertheless it simply fell down. It was clearly and plausibly a controlled demolition. But you ain't heard nothing yet. Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center, accidentally told PBS that he had the building demolished.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Outrageous. Simply outrageous. It takes months of preparation and planning to do a controlled demolition like this one. They had to have put these charges in place before September 11th. Larry Silverstein was kind enough to tell us that they demolished this building on September 11th.
And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building.
But who was they? And are we supposed to think that they didn't have explosive charges in place in the Twin Towers? Of course they did. Now, this video is called Justice for 9/11 because we want to see the guilty parties arrested and punished. Silverstein knows who they are. He tried to collect $7 billion from his insurance company for the attacks. He's in league with the killers. And based on this evidence, he should be arrested and prosecuted. And who else should be punished for this outrageous crime? Richard Myers should be very high on our list. 50 minutes after the first plane hit, 50 minutes after everyone in the country knew that we were under attack, with all of the defenses in place around the Pentagon, this guy couldn't get one single shot fired in our defense. But Myers is just a soldier. He follows orders, and his orders come from George W. Bush. Bush liked the job Myers did on September 11th. He liked it so well that he promoted Myers the following week. For that alone, he should be arrested and prosecuted. But let's take a closer look at the president. As many people know, on the morning of September 11th, Bush arrived at a school in Florida. However, you may not know that Bush has said,
Well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and
What? What did he just say?
Well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and
No TV channel showed the first plane flying into the building. If Bush saw the first plane crash that morning, it was on a closed circuit from a secret government source. That by itself, having cameras in place for a live shot of the first plane hitting the Twin Towers, suggests that Bush and his people knew in advance that the attacks were coming. But we're just getting started.
Well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and I thought it was pilot error.
Bush and everyone else in the world knew that the World Trade Center was a terrorist target. It had been bombed before in 1993. FEMA showed the towers as a target on the cover of their 1997 study on terrorism. The Justice Department showed the towers as a target on the cover of their manual distributed to local police in the year 2000. For 2 years, the Pentagon had been running drills in which the towers and the Pentagon were targets of hijacked planes. And on August 6th, 36 days before the September 11th attacks, Bush was given a briefing from a CIA memo on the threat of terrorist attacks.
I believe the title was Bin Laden Determined to Attack Inside the United States.
And Bush wants us to believe that with all that background, he and his advisors thought that this was pilot error, and thought that the best way he could carry out his oath to defend the citizens of the United States was to sit and listen to a story about a pet goat. After the second plane struck, Bush's chief of staff walked in and told him that the country was under attack, and Bush continued to sit there as his people begged for rescue. If you believe his story, this shows the grossest criminal negligence for which he and his entire staff should be arrested and prosecuted. Secretary Rice also pleaded innocent by reason of stupidity.
And I said no one could have imagined them taking a plane, slamming it into the Pentagon, I'm paraphrasing now, into the World Trade Center, using planes as a missile.
But she and President Bush are clearly lying. Let's present this one point again. As late as June 2001, 3 months before the attacks, the Pentagon conducted drills in which they pretended that hijacked airliners were being crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. They knew. And the fact that they are trying to pass off such weak and obvious lies shows that they are part of a criminal conspiracy. They want us to think that they were asleep, mentally. But you see, it doesn't matter if they were asleep. I mean, suppose the attacks had been at 3 a.m., when Bush and Rice actually were asleep. What then? Is that all terrorists have to do, is wait for these guys to go to sleep? You see, the U.S. has the world's biggest, most advanced, and most expensive defense systems. There are procedures that are followed, whether our leaders are asleep or awake. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, there are high-speed jet fighters fired up and sitting on the runway, waiting for an attack, waiting for a plane to diverge from its flight plan and start heading where it doesn't belong. This happens about 100 times a year, that these planes have to take off and catch somebody who's wandered into the wrong place. These standard procedures should have stopped the attacks on the World Trade Center, and the planes at Andrews Air Force Base would have taken 8 seconds to reach the Pentagon. Again, they didn't need orders from the President or the National Security Advisor to do it. The destruction in New York and at the Pentagon did not occur because someone failed to order jets to intercept and shoot down the hijackers. Someone gave an order not to shoot, or else no doubt there would have been shots fired. The question is, who gave the order? And just as Silverstein accidentally told PBS that they had explosives in place in Building 7.
And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation, accidentally told the 9/11 Commission who gave the order not to attempt to intercept or shoot down the planes. Mineta testified that at 9:28 he was in a bunker under the White House with Vice President Cheney.
There was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Cheney said, the order still stands, and a few moments later a plane smashed into the Pentagon. A giant, slow-moving 757 that could not even have penetrated Pentagon airspace on September 10th. On September 11th, not only penetrated Pentagon airspace, but crashed into the Pentagon. So, what was Cheney talking about when he said, the order still stands? What order still stands? Obviously, with all the vast defenses in place to protect the Pentagon, if it was an order to shoot, the plane would have been shot down, no? Isn't that obvious? If it were an order to shoot, the people who failed to fire even one shot would have incurred the wrath of Dick Cheney, would have been court-martialed instead of promoted, no? If it were an order to shoot, the young man would not have run to Cheney to find out if the order still stood. He would have been busy carrying out the order to shoot, obviously. So it's also obvious that Cheney had ordered the defenses not to shoot, but to stand down. He had ordered no shots to be fired. No wonder the young officer couldn't believe it. Can you believe it? Because Mineta's sworn testimony provides the clearest possible evidence for a criminal indictment to be brought against Cheney. And this indictment must be brought against him and the rest of these criminals before they kill again. If we don't stop them, I'm afraid, we will deserve what we get. These criminals have already been shown to have used anthrax, biological weapons from military stockpiles, against American citizens, including U.S. senators. What this article says is that the anthrax which killed secretaries in Senator Daschle's offices matches exactly the DNA of the anthrax manufactured by the U.S. military. Both samples had to have come from the exact same cow. They've already been shown to be studying methods for delivering these weapons massively against the American people. Please, for your own sake, for the sake of your children and grandchildren, sign this petition. Take it and circulate it and return it to us. It may already be too late to stop them, but it's way too early to quit trying.